You are listening to the Apex Hour hosted by Ryan Paul on KSUU Thunder 91.1. This show allows more personal time with our guests, allowing them to give us their stories and opinions. We will also give you new music to listen to, hoping you enjoy some new sounds and genres. Welcome to this episode of the Apex Hour.
Welcome to the Apex Radio Hour. I'm producer Kason Graff, and I'm here today with Professor of History and Apex Director Ryan Paul and our special guest, Lauren Markham. Turning it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kason. We're so happy to have you here, Lauren. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So Lauren Markham is an author and journalist, or journalist and author. I don't know how you would like to, which one you claim to be, which one is most important to you.
But probably author, but equal.
Author and journalist. Most recently, her first book was called The Faraway Brothers. Her second book, which just came out, and in fact is one of a New York Times notable book, A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging. And we're excited to have you here to talk about some really important things, all linked with one thing that's important to me, which is story. So the first question I always like to ask is kind of a how we get to now question. So how do you get to where you are right now?
In my life?
In your life, yeah. Preferably you don't have to go back to when your mom and dad met.
First, I was born. No, just kidding. I studied writing in college. I was always a writer. I mean, I wrote in high school. I wrote voraciously as a little kid. I actually got my master's after college in fiction writing. And I majored in literature and creative writing, and I minored in political science. So I was always interested in addition to my life and inner world as a writer, I was always really interested in the way the world worked and like the mechanisms and structures of our world that led to injustice, and sort of trying to understand those structures in the name of hopefully transforming them. But those two things were really separate. My sort of interest in politics and social issues and my interest in writing, or at least I had sort of siloed them. And it wasn't honestly until later on in my 20s when I was working at the intersection of immigration and education. I was working at the Oakland Unified School District and working with refugee and immigrant young people and their families, and also writing, that it sort of hit me, even though I read magazines all the time, I read long-form journalism, that it was like, oh, wait, journalism is actually just a way of writing about social issues that matter to me and to the world. And so I sort of started my hand at it really, really slowly. I didn't have aspirations to do daily journalism. I did a little bit of it, sort of quicker turnaround pieces. That was less interesting to me, mostly because I wasn't that good at it. But I was also much more interested in looking sort of retrospectively at, not necessarily reporting from something at its boiling point, but trying to understand things in kind of in a longer arc. So I tended to, my aspirations were that I wanted to write longer magazine style pieces and books, and that's what I'm doing.
So was there I always like to ask a question about the eureka moment. Was there a moment when you said, this is exactly what I want to do? I mean, there's an idea of like, I want to be a writer, but was there a moment that you can recall when you said, this is the kind of writing I want to do?
I think I always knew. I think the eureka moment was less like, I want to do this, but more like, oh, this is available to me. This is something you can do. This is something that people can do. I read like The New Yorker and Harper's Magazine and the New York Times Magazine and sort of like long form journalism pieces all the time. But I think I had some concept that there were just like fancy people who just, were like some angel kind of bopped them on the head and said, you can do this. But in fact, it was just trying, you know what I mean? It was just trying to do it. So I think that was like in my late 20s. I got a fellowship, an environmental journalism fellowship, to write this one particular story. And when I was with my cohort, I was like, oh, you just write an editor and say, I have an idea. And if they're interested, they write you back and pay you to do it. So I think that was more the eureka moment. So
what was that first idea?
It was writing about climate migration, so environmental refugees. And this was in 2011. And it was, I'd done some shorter form journalism stuff, like kind of a little bit of like, that was back in like the blog era. So it was like blogging for some immigration journalism outlets, but really short stuff. I was looking at East Africa and environmental migration in East Africa. But looking more broadly, any magazine journalism is like, there's a story you're telling. So, people fleeing from Ethiopia into Kenya because of climate change. But then there's like a larger, it's generally as a window into something larger. So in this case, the window into something larger, like a larger question, societally on planet Earth is, climate migration was back then and still is now the largest predictive cause of forced migration on the planet, but we don't have any international framework for, like, there is no such thing, legally speaking, as a climate refugee or an environmental refugee. So if you leave your country for reasons of climate change or, massive weather events caused by climate change, et cetera, there's no, and you cross a border, you're just an unauthorized immigrant. There's no international framework.
It's not like seeking asylum.
Exactly.
Or
there's nothing to apply for. There's no designation. It's just, so we talk about climate refugees, but that's sort of all in lowercase. You know what I mean? We don't have a designation. Guess what? 2024, we still don't.
So I don't know anything really much about journalism in the sense that how that goes about. So what was the first moment where somebody reached out to you and said, hey, I've got an assignment for you?
Mm-hmm. It wasn't, I remember very clearly, it was someone who's, I'm writing for him now. I adore him and owe him a lot in my career. He's a editor and writer named Paul Reyes, who's the editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review. And he reached out to me saying, I just recently got this editor job. I think this was probably 2012. And he was like, I heard from some other people that you're a great writer. I want to get some new names in the magazine. Got any ideas for me? And I talked him through a bunch of stuff. He was like, those sound great. Send me some pitches. He was like, for lots of reasons, none of these ended up being right. But you mentioned this other idea. Can you send me a pitch about that? And I was like, oh, sure. And I didn't exactly know how to, I sort of, it wasn't really a story. It was sort of a vague topic. And it was about unaccompanied minors crossing the border into the U.S. So I pitched him that story and he was like, okay, and we'll take it. And he sent me down to, I had a plane ticket and I got to get a rental car and stay in bad motels. And it was so exciting. And I was reporting on really intense stuff. And ultimately, long story short, that piece was the precursor for what ended up being The Faraway Brothers, which was my first book.
And that was, what is the thesis, the story behind that in a nutshell?
That book, yeah. So the book is about two Salvadoran identical twins who are born in the wake of the Civil War in El Salvador, kind of this moment of relative peace and sort of hope, but come of age in tandem with the rise of El Salvador's gangs, which are actually exports from the U.S. The creations of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. immigration policy. And it's the story of their kind of leaving El Salvador and coming to the United States and fighting for a right to stay. Yeah.
But how do you connect with those people? Obviously you didn't know those two kids.
This is the rare exception where I actually did because of my work at the school district. I met them not as a journalist first, which posed all sorts of ethical questions, challenges that were sort of those ethical questions and challenges sort of at the heart of writing that book. But mostly I don't know any, I don't know the people I write about it in my new book, A Map of Future Ruins. I didn't know them, any of them. I met them and I met them because they work for the UN, Agency for Refugees. And so they had an email and I emailed them, or I met them because I met someone who told me that there are these elders living in the town where her mom lives who were descendants of the Asia Minor Greek refugee swap. And so I asked if I could go meet them, or in the case of, at the core of my new book, there are these 6 Afghan kids who get arrested and charged totally bogusly for the crime of burning down their refugee camp. And for them, they were in prison. And so I wrote them, I tried to get access to the prison. I couldn't. I wrote them a letter, had it translated into Farsi, had their lawyers take it in, then 2 months later when they were going in, and I said, here's my number, call me if you're interested, and they did. And so I struck up a conversation with them that way, from prison. But I also meet the people I write about by walking straight up to people. I've done a lot of reporting at the border, just walking straight up to people and saying, hi, I'm a journalist, here's what I'm doing, can I ask you a question? That's probably my least favorite part of reporting because I just feel like I'm bothering people, but I also have made some really, I've built some really pretty remarkable relationships that way, and have learned a lot that way too.
So has there been I want to get to your new book here in a second, but has there ever been a pitch that you keep kind of coming back to that no one ever picks up on?
Yes,
like, this
always.
is the one I want to do, but...
Yeah. And some of them you abandon, and you're like, no one ever wanted me to do that. Or some of them, they go away and then they come back, and then you're like, now is the moment where someone is interested in me, doing that. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, I have one, this was so frustrating. I had a piece and I got the assignment. It was for a really big magazine who I won't name, but it was great. And it was to do a piece on medical neglect in immigration detention. And I got connected to this young man who'd been in isolation. This is pre-COVID, like isolation immigration prison because of these terrible allergies that he had. There was no reason he should have been locked up. He was in isolation for 2 years. He was 19 years old when he first went in. He kept having seizures. He was in rural Louisiana. I had access to 600 pages of his medical records. I wrote the story, and for whatever reason, it got killed by the magazine. And I tried to pitch it again, and then COVID happened. So it's like I made this connection with this young person, spent all of this time and energy trying to bring his stories to justice, and then it just sort of fizzled. But then I included it in an op-ed I wrote 2 years later. So, if you sort of the long arc of one's career, like a story might not work out, but it'll come. There are ways that you find to incorporate that story into something else.
To bring them back.
But yeah, I'm working on a couple now that I feel like I shouldn't talk about, but I'm like, how does no one want the story? It's brilliant.
So as we get into your new book, and we'll talk more about it after our first break, but I think what I find interesting as I read it is this kind of connection between who you are as a person and the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost like, I would imagine there are journalists who say, I want to swim with the sharks. Say, I'll write a story. Can I write a story about swimming with sharks? But ultimately, you have this connection about this really is about you finding your own story, as well as you telling the story of these other people. Yeah,
it is. I mean, it's reporting on migration and borders, and particularly in Greece. So the core narrative of the story is these 6 young Afghans who were refugees in Greece who were arrested for burning down their refugee camp. But another thread of the story is my own inquiry into my Greek ancestry, and also my inquiry into key and very complex ethical questions as a reporter of what does it mean to be telling other people's stories? How do we tell stories justly? How do we not flatten other people's experiences? How do we continue to write stories in the face of so much injustice happening, and the feeling sometimes that what good does writing do? So yeah, these are some questions at the core of the book that kind of implicate myself, that do implicate myself. So I have not sort of erased or effaced myself from this narrative or faded into the background, but I'm actually turning a mirror on some of this.
And it's like this idea of immigration as leaving someplace and becoming something else. Mm-hmm. Like I think you mentioned in your book about speaking Greek, right? Your family had emphasized we are Greek, but nobody speaks Greek. No one had been to Greece. It was more of a cultural thing. And then you talk about your grandma or your great-grandma? Your great-grandma who tell her story. I just found it so fascinating.
Yeah, so she came here with her dad had already come here. She left the island of Andros when she was a little kid. They tried to live in Athens for a while. Then they boarded a ship in Patras, Greece, on the western shore, got to New York, moved up to Boston where her dad had sort of started working. There was a big Greek population in Boston. This was 1914. And then pretty quickly she married, had 4 kids. By the time she was 24, she had 4 kids and was a widow. And so she worked in a Greek diner. She was the manager of a Greek diner in New Haven, Connecticut, and sent her kids to college, sent all of her kids to college, even her girls. And, very much in my family that's like, she's our bootstrap story. She came here, she struggled and suffered and worked incredibly hard, and because thanks to her we get to be who we are. I think that story is a little bit overly sanitized because she lost 2 children very, very young, in sort of tragic circumstances that I think can't be the circumstances of their deaths can't be fully divorced from like the challenges of migration and the context in which they were being raised. My great grandmother also really pretty like metabolized the racial hierarchy here pretty quickly and understood that darker people were seen as lesser and treated poorly, and so really encouraged my grandmother and my great aunt to not get tan, to not speak Greek outside of the house, and to basically assimilate, in which they did.
And your grandmother carried some of that on with her own kids as far as not teaching Greek and that kind of thing as well? Yeah,
it was interesting. I mean, the way my dad put it was that my grandmother would use Greek to tell secrets. So it's like when they knew the juicy stuff was happening when the Greek came out, because the younger, so my grandmother's generation all spoke Greek, but they were told not to really do it outside of the house. And then they didn't teach their kids, but they used it among themselves to tell secrets. So he would sort of say the cigarettes would come out and the booze would come out and the Greek would start rolling, and you knew that that was when the good stories were happening. You just didn't know what was being said.
Or else that Christmas was coming.
Yeah. So, I think that they didn't pass it on, I think, because of the sense of like, well, what good is this language here? But also some internalized shame. And also now we can tell secrets, and gosh, my husband and I speak Spanish all the time around our kid, because we're both fluent in Spanish. She's not. And it's just like a way to say things that she can't hear. Mm-hmm. So I get it.
So, and then if you talk about in the story that your brother, I think, decides to take a DNA test and found some interesting things.
Yeah, he found that in fact we're 7% Italian. Didn't know that. And that it doesn't actually name Greek. This is a while ago, so those things change. I actually have been like, I wonder if I should like update that. I'd be curious to see like what is updated. Because the more people do it, sort of the more data they have, and the more and there's also been a lot of questions about the science of those. But he also found that the Greek wasn't named, it was just Balkans, vaguely Balkan, which is a whole region and not necessarily just Greece, but it encompasses Greece. Anyway, the whole family text chain was like, we're Greek. But actually what that DNA test reflects is that and I write about this in the book, any attempt to sort of locate oneself and one's ancestor in a fixed way on a map, for most people on this planet, that is a long story, and that's almost an impossible thing to do, right? So, like, the fact, while it was surprising to us that there's Italian mixed in with what we understood to be our Greek ancestor, well, if you look, Greece and Italy are right next to each other. So why is that bizarre, right? Like, why is that strange? That's not strange at all. It's just doesn't map one-to-one to the story we've been told and told ourselves about who we are and what it means to be who we are.
Because we've defined ourselves as Greek, we have not defined ourselves as Italian.
Even though when you look at a map, you're like, yeah, same. I mean, look, they're right there. You know what I mean? Like, it's the Greek and Italian are defined by the nation state. Like those are identities defined by the nation state. If you're just defining it by sort of like region on Earth, well, listen, Greece and Italy are pretty close to each other, so like makes sense. Someone took a boat at some point. You know what I mean? Like, that's it.
And then you factor in this idea, like you've talked about with your great grandma, that we're American as well.
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean to be an American?
Yeah.
Versus...
What does it mean to be U.S. American? I think for most people, people who are not indigenous to this country were either forcibly brought here or came here, perhaps by force of circumstance, not by brute force, by force of circumstance, or by choice. And I think a lot of, and I explore this in the book, a lot of white European Americans, or like, white Americans of European descent, do, like my family, do have a hankering and a hungering for a homeland, for some identity beyond this identity, which is relatively new, complicated, fraught, and not sort of singular. So it's like, what does it mean to be U.S. American? Well, it's a big place. It's a polarized place. It's a pretty vast place. It's a pretty new place, according to human history. But I can say, I think I know what it means to be Greek, or I think I know what it means to be Italian, because that's a faraway place. And if I can hook my belonging to that, in part, I have a better understanding of who I am. And I think that's a really, really natural feeling that I share and have shared at different points in my life, that yearning. And I also think it can curdle into a dangerous one that means that one's own belonging is at the exclusion of others.
Which is an interesting idea, because for many years in the past of this country, it was you wanted to forget where you came from, right? You wanted to adopt what was seen to be this American idea versus, and now it's like, well, wait a minute, we're kind of trying to recapture, we're diversifying ourselves by saying, well, I'm from here, so I'm going to start, my ancestors are from Scotland, so I'm going to wear kilt.
Yeah, exactly. And feel proud about that, which, like, no problem. But, like, so long as it's not at the exclusion of others. And I think what we've seen happen, and actually the 23andMe stuff has led to this, is, all these white supremacist chat forums, they're very obsessed with, like, whether it's 23andMe or whatever genetic test, because they want to prove, like, oh, I have, like, Norse whatever, I'm a Norwegian prince, or I'm a Viking, or I come from, and they want to sort of have this feeling of, oh, I can trace a lineage back to some past greatness, and therefore that reifies my belief in white supremacy and reifies my, like, contemporary political beliefs.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's take our first break, and then I want to get into the core of your book. So as anyone who listens to us know, that we ask our guests to give us a list of songs that, for whatever reason, meant something to them, and we play those during our break. So we did the same thing with Lauren. The first song that we're going to play is a song called Traversy by Constantinople. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose this?
Yeah, this was music I listened to a lot while writing this book. It's actually a Istanbul-based band that is playing with a West African in this album, Constantinople. They're playing with and I'm so sorry, I forget his name right now, but a West African musician, and it's really beautiful music that is both it has a lot of the sort of musical roots of Greek music, but also is Turkish, which makes sense because, again, Greece and Turkey were once not so geopolitically distinct as they are seen now, and also it has that African influence, and so I think it's it points to the globalized cooperative nature of art.
Cool. This is Traversy by Constantinople.
That was Traverses by Constantinople and Blai Sissoko. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kaysen. I appreciate it. So we're Lauren Markham, author and journalist. Her new book is called A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging. So let's talk about the book. And it begins, we've talked about your journey, but let's talk about what the reason you're in Greece professionally, not personally. Yep. So there is at the time still is, a refugee crisis of people heading into the EU, right? Because fleeing everything, right? And the route that makes the most sense for some is what?
The route that makes the most sense for some is crossing from Turkey, not in the EU, into Greece. Yes, in the EU, either across their land border along the river, the Evros River, as it's known in Greece, or I think more commonly across the sea, the slip of sea between Greece and Turkey.
Which is exceedingly dangerous.
It is. It's exceedingly dangerous. It sort of pales in comparison to danger, compared to crossing from Libya to Spain, for instance, or Libya into Italy, a many days journey. It's much less dangerous, but people shipwreck and drown all the time.
Partly because I forget the word that you use, the people they hire to give them the boat.
Smugglers.
They just put them on boats and push them off.
Boat and steer. And this is a sort of side note, but they put them on a boat and steer because they charge astronomical amounts per person. It's often like €1,000 to cross, and they cram a ton of people on these boats. So they're not that seaworthy to begin with. They cram so many people on this boat that people have smothered to death, like under the weight of other people. The smugglers don't go on the boat because A, if they get caught, they can be prosecuted. B, they're taking a seat. That's €1,000 that, and it's dangerous. They don't want to do that crossing. So they kind of often will say, okay, you, Ryan, you take the helm, you steer. Sometimes they'll give people a cut rate for that, but generally not. It's just like, you're the one, you were a fisherman, great, you steer. Oh, you drove a car, you steer. And what the Greek government is doing is finding the people who are steering the boat and arresting them and putting them in prison for smuggling. So the Greek penal system, the second largest category of people in Greek prison right now, are people who are refugees who were accused of human smuggling, even though it was just themselves, having to drive the boat because they were told to by the smuggler with a gun.
And when you say drive the boat, do they have motors on them? Or
they have motors on them, yeah.
And they just point and say, this is the direction you want to keep going.
So they often don't know when they hit land. It's not like they're like, oh, that's Lesbos. They have no idea where it's like they hit land wherever they hit. And it could be all the way south, the island of Ikaria and Kos, or it could be all the way up in northern Lesbos. There's a pretty long stretch of possibility there. And
in the course of that journey, how long would it take if you just had a straight shot?
Like if you weren't on an overpacked
No, if you were in the overpacked boat, how long does it take?
I mean, look, often 4 or 5, 6 hours.
And in fact, I think you write about this. The Greek Coast Guard comes out and swamps these boats, right?
Yeah. So one of the tactics that the Greek government has used, and this is a complex story. I mean, the ethics aren't complex here, but the history is somewhat complex. Many people are crossing into Greece, and Greece is managing a disproportionate amount of the logistics of sort of apprehending, housing, and adjudicating the cases of refugees trying to come into the EU, the vast majority of whom have no interest in being in Greece and certainly no interest in staying in Greece once they get there. But the EU law requires you to stay in the first place that you land. So if you land in Italy, you have to have your asylum case go, you have to wait in Italy until your asylum case is either approved or denied. If it's denied, you go back or you appeal it, or eventually you're deported back. If it's approved, then you can actually transit to other countries within the EU. That's sort of the simplified version, but that's how it goes. So because so many people are landing in Greece, Greece is housing all of these people, and the Greek government doesn't want to do it because they're like, they don't want to come here. They don't want to be here. This island of Lesbos, it's an island of 90,000 people, and we have 10,000 refugees here. This has been happening for years. The refugees are cutting down the olive trees because, to burn so that they can be warm in the winter. They're killing goats because they don't have enough food. Our people are pissed. Like, this isn't, we don't want this. Like, let's have people let's have Germany like take some of these folks and let's kind of even this out. And the EU is kind of like, no. So what the Greek government has started to do is over the past few years, they've done it for a long time, but it became around 2019 sort of a policy of a shadow policy, something called pushbacks, where they drive out to sea, they'll tour around a boat, swamp a boat, sometimes destroy the engine or take all the people off of that boat, go back out to Turkish waters, put people in a dinghy with no motor and let them drift so that they'll be apprehended by the Turkish Coast Guard or Turkish authorities and brought back to Turkey, so they won't make it to Greece. There have been many, many, many cases in which the Greek government finds refugees who've actually made it to land, pluck them off of Greek soil before they're able to get to officially register the refugee camp, take them back out to sea and deposit them in one of these rafts. So incredibly illegal, incredibly immoral behavior that's happening, right now probably on a monthly basis, if not on a weekly basis.
And in fact, the smugglers give them life jackets that are often
counterfeit,
fake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to pay extra for a life jacket, and sometimes they're fake, so they actually swamp with water instead of acting as flotation devices.
And so many of them drown as well on the way there.
And not just because of that, they drown because they don't know how to swim, or they drown because they're flung out of a boat in the middle of the sea in the night, or they crash against these, people have seen images of Greece. It's beautiful. It's like these rocky, cliffside coastlines. Right.
So obviously, one could in some way sympathize with the people of Greece saying we're not equipped to handle all this. But at the same time, are other EU countries, they don't necessarily want all those people coming to, so yes. they're not being Greece is kind of stuck in this.
That's how many Greeks, including Greeks on the left, feel, is that it's like the EU is outsourcing its migration questions and challenges to Greece, and Greece is actually externalizing and outsourcing it to the islands, because like most people don't make it to Athens, right? They make it to the islands. So it's these, hotspot islands where all the refugees are. There's a lot of animosity there. And the other complicating factor here is that in the wake of the 2008 debt crisis, that started really in like the southeast of the United States, or, the United States mortgage crisis that kind of tanked the entire global economy. The Greeks were hit incredibly hard. And they ended up, to make a very long story quite short, they ended up, the powers of Northern Europe kind of hitched Greece to a debt cycle where for every dollar that a Greek made, the government owed $100 to the Northern European bank. So it was just this, kind of interminable cycle of debt that was also, and I won't really get into it, but it was also sort of an externalization of all of Europe's problems to Greece. Greece was sort of the straw man and the fall guy for that. So there's already, and it led to a rush of suicides. It led to, incredible austerity within Greece and incredible poverty, huge unemployment rates. So many Greek young people had to leave. So it's like there was already this feel. It's sort of a double punch, for many Greeks, that Northern Europe, tanked our economy, and now we're the ones who are having to disproportionately support these refugees. So even people who are really sympathetic to the refugees and really on the refugee side and really pro-migration and pro-human rights are still like, what the heck, to the rest of Europe.
I think you tell the story. Is it a dentist who had lost all his money? And,
yeah. Mm-hmm. And Pavlos. He was a retired dentist, and he had a pension, and you retire and you're going to get €800 a month for the rest of your life. And then all of a sudden, after the 2008 crisis, because a bunch of jerks sold predatory, mortgages to people in the U.S., the whole world comes crashing down. And then the Germans and French get together and say, and Belgians, I think, and say, okay, actually, to save our banks, we're going to make Greece pay. That guy's pension was cut to €400 a month. It's like he had to go back to work. And that's not the worst of the stories, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So Greece builds a camp to house these pre-COVID refugees that have come across, that's built to hold 2,500.
Yes, exactly.
And then in a space of less than 5 years, it
at its peak, there were 20,000 people living there. At the time of the fire, there were 11,000 people living there. So, more than 3 times.
So 11,000 people that are registered
Yeah.
and are being processed,
Yeah.
and I'm assuming being fed in
Yes,
some
in
way.
lines, food lines that
Right.
hours long, but yes.
And then one night a fire breaks out. Can
Yes.
you talk about that?
Yeah, so on the night of September 8th, 2020, a fire broke out. And this was, I think it was like the 247th or something like that fire that had been, there is a specific number, and I think it's that fire that had erupted in that camp because you had all of these people living in tents and during the snow. So they'd, set up makeshift cook stoves and they'd rig up wacky electricity stuff to charge their phones, and things would erupt, and people are living so close together that they just, the fire jumps. So it was not the first fire, but this was a big one, and a big one pretty quickly. All the eyewitnesses were like, oh, wow. And you could kind of see it in the distance from where a lot of the witnesses I talked to were, and then it was like, oh, this is coming toward us fast. It was moving really quickly. So the vast majority of those 11,000 people living there at that night evacuated and moved onto the street. There's sort of one road going into the Moria camp. It's all hills, like olive groves, and many of the people were actually not living in any formal camp. They were living in makeshift tents among the olive groves. And so there's a road, and the road in one direction goes toward the capital city of Mytilene, and in the other direction, it goes to the town of Moria. So the Moria camp is named after Moria town. So the refugees fled the road because, they're set back off on the run. They've grabbed what they could. And those headed toward town reached a blockade, and it was a police blockade sort of saying, no, you're not moving. You're not going to the capital city. There's fire behind you, police ahead of you. That's what someone said. One of the refugee eyewitnesses said to me, or one of the guys who was there. He was like, behind me was fire, and ahead of me was police. They were tear gassing people, saying you can't go on. Behind them, these like fascist factions, super right wing fascist factions, blocked the road to Moria City. So they were stuck on this road, and they remained there for about 6 days. Like 7 or 8 days. They started moving people into a new makeshift camp. There were very few amenities. People were going to the bathroom on the side of the road. There's very little food and very little water. The government wasn't letting any of the NGOs come in because they were sort of trying to do crowd control. But any time a food truck would come in, it was sort of bombarded with desperate people. There was no medical care. This was at the height of COVID, right? This was September 2020. It was a bad situation. Within 6 days, the Minister of Migration goes on TV and says, we found the perpetrators. The arsonists have been found. They will be arrested and brought to justice. This was arson. And they arrested after that. So he said we found them. But after that, 6 young people were arrested. And I chronicled the sort of experiences of 2 of them in particular, Hassan and Ali, in the book. They were arrested and charged for arson, and then went to trial the next June and were convicted in kind of a kangaroo court.
And most of these young men are under the age of 18.
Yeah, 5 of them were minors at the time.
So we'll pick this story up here, but let's take our second break if we could, and then I want to continue with this idea. So this is a song that I'm very excited about. Yeah. She Passed Through by Dirty Three.
Oh yeah.
So tell us about this song.
This is another song that I listened to a lot while writing because it had just enough of an upbeat but serious tempo, and has no words, but was really moving to me.
Okay, yeah. This is She Passed Through by Dirty Three.
That was She Passed Through by the Dirty Three. You're listening to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Kaysen. So we left off talking about the fire in the camp and these 6 boys, young men that were convicted, tried and convicted after the fact, really, of the announcement. And I want other people to read your book to kind of fill all the details in. But what I want to talk about really, and the question I have is, so then, first of all, why do you think Greece moves so quickly to do this? Because, I mean, ultimately it's like you talked about one eyewitness, and it's obviously been proven that was not the case. Even I think that guy always admitted that, I don't know, it was somebody.
Yeah, the evidence is so thin that it's absurd that these young people got convicted.
Right.
Yes,
So why is that momentum there to blame the fire on these 6 guys?
Yeah. I talked about it in my talk today a little bit, but we are seeing around the world an increasing conflation between the immigrant and the criminal. And instead of sort of these weary, desperate people showing up at the doorstep, it's like these marauding invaders showing up at the doorstep, the doorstep being the border. And so I think it's a couple of fold. I think that, like young Latinx immigrants in the United States, and particularly young men, have been, it's like they're gangsters, they're thieves, they're rapists, they're coming here to take what's yours, to take what's not theirs. We have to be careful of them. They're going to change the profile of this country. They're going to bring their, nefarious ways. That has very much a really parallel, almost like bizarro parallel thing is happening in Greece when it comes to the unaccompanied minors, largely from Afghanistan, Syria, from elsewhere as well. These young men, dark skin, can't trust them, like that ideology. So I think that's what made it easy. That's what facilitated it, because already in the minds of, and I should say, there is such a humanitarian movement in Greece and such a solidarity movement in Greece. Honestly, one that is more profound and exciting to me than what I've seen here in the United States. So I want to honor and give credit to that. But among many people in Greece, there is that notion that the immigrants are criminals, that the refugees can't be trusted, has been percolating from the top, actually. So I don't even know if percolating is the right word. The right-wing politicians are really setting up that ideology and banging that, campaigning and banging that ideology into people. And so I think that facilitated it, made it easy to be like, yeah, these 6 will do. But I also think there was something else going on, which is that the reason the camp burned down is, we now know the best evidence for why the camp burned down is it was 2 cramped quarters. That was the government's doing, right? Not, and I should say the government and the EU, government's doing with the EU's sort of, blissful, not even ignorance, but they sort of turned an eye from it, right? And because of these horrible unsanitary conditions, and just like lack of humanitarian causes, and because of climate change. That's the bet, that there was really, really dry conditions and really high winds. So in a way, this is the government being able to say, it wasn't us who did this. It's the refugees who did this, right? If we blame them, then we don't have to take any responsibility for this. But then the third thing I would say is that there's also this really powerful narrative that's taken hold in Greece. And I saw this in the trial when I went to the trial, the appeals trial last March of these 6 young men. Actually, it was actually 4 of the 6 young men. The prosecutor was saying, they came to Greece, we welcomed them, and look, they desecrated our land. See, look, they don't care about Greece. Look at how they treat us. Look at how, so it's not just the immigrant and the criminal, but it's the ungrateful, the ingrate. They come here and they're ungrateful. They burned this down and they need to be punished for that, which is really just a way of saying we need to punish the refugees for being refugees.
And it's interesting that this is moving along the same lines as, I think, an article I read just last week about how Greece is really saying we've got too many tourists.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's, I mean, and you mentioned this in your book,
Yep.
but we are,
Yep.
we have so many people
Yep.
that it's just taxing our.
That's one of the stories I
Our way
want,
of
the
life.
long form stories I want to write that no one's getting me back to. But yes, yes, exactly. Too many Airbnbs, so we can't afford to live here. This is becoming a country for the tourists, which is fascinating because Greece's economy is, Tourists are foreigners who tend to have tended to be really, really welcome because, come see our ruins, come see our islands, come to our beaches. But yeah, even that is reaching its boiling point.
Well, and they've built you talk about this, that they've kind of rebuilt the mythos of Greece as I think you mentioned that the prime minister of Greece comes to Washington
US,
and says, "You owe us,
basically
for you," right?
But he does it in like that really sort of backward, what's that kind of like humble brag kind of way, where he's like, "I love coming." This was a few years ago. "I love coming to the United States. We feel so kin and welcome here because all your streets look like ours, all your buildings look like our buildings." Or he's basically sort of saying like, if it weren't for us, this we're the birthplace of you. Like you come from us.
Thanks for democracy.
You're
welcome for democracy.
We gave that to you.
So what I love about your book is, and your story is this idea of I envision two trains on separate tracks. Right, you've got this train about the boys and the camp and the refugee issues, and the folly of borders in the sense that they're lines on a map that are made for deliberate reasons, and you have this other train with you, and you're almost a travel explorer. You're like an explorer, like exploring yourself, and your husband's with you, and you have some harrowing adventures in the story as well. And
harrowing, like needlessly harrowing.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's what's a good
But
journalist
I've had
do,
like
right?
actual harrowing experience as a journalist in pursuit of the story. Like these are just stupid. Some of these, but
But the trains come together at some point. And I want, if you could just talk briefly about the intersection of those things. I mean, what do you learn? Are you satisfied with what you have learned there in both of these areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I really like that imagery. I think they come together in a couple of ways. One of them is and this is the spidey sense that sort of got me to start reporting this book, is that, I have this mythic story of my ancestors who came from this place, Greece, that I've never been to. And they came long, long ago. They came from there. And that the mythology there is that, I have this mythology of belonging to this place I've never been. That same place has a contemporary mythology of all of these new people coming. And the mythology is that they're bad, and there's an invasion, a contemporary invasion coming, right? And interestingly, the mythology of my family, they were treated as invaders when they came to this country, the United States, once they left Greece. So it's sort of like seeing these kind of parallels in history. I wouldn't say quite repeating itself, because my family came under much more beneficial and kinder circumstances to the U.S., and the circumstances they left are much better than, even though they were difficult for them at the time, than, Afghans leaving Afghanistan right now, right? So I don't want to make a false parallel there, or I don't want to make a false equivalent. But that was really kind of meaningful to me, that kind of looking at those narratives split by about 100 years side by side. But the way they come together also is because, like, I am a journalist who tells other people's stories, and I was interested in the way and concerned about the way I write, what I write, how I write, even though I do it from an impulse of justice and, wanting to tell just stories and wanting to uncover and describe injustices and their costs. That is my impulse for being a journalist. I was still concerned and preoccupied, especially if my first book came out, with like, how am I perpetuating or contributing to these problematic mythologies by what I write and how I write them. So my sort of consciousness and reality as a journalist is very much at the heart of this book as well. How do I tell just stories? And, another preoccupation here is like, is writing action? Like, is writing something, is that the same thing as doing something? And does it even do anything, And you asked, like, did I come to any conclusions? I mean, I think I maybe came a little bit full circle but sort of one of those things is like I came back where I started, but I'm better off than when I began, kind of, I see more clearly than when I began, which is, kind of classic, like mythological hero's journey narrative, or shape. But I would say that what I came to was that that journalism is a worthy pursuit, and that the goal is not to just being a writer concerned with justice is not like it's not like a room whose door you open and then you're in it. It's just like a constant state that you're trying to work toward forever. You know what I mean? And it's like, that's the work is actually to question. The work isn't to arrive. You're never just going to arrive at a place where you're like, yes, I am like a just storyteller, not contributing to, pernicious mythologies. It's like, just keep at it and keep trying.
So what have you learned in this process that informs you now being a parent?
Oh, interesting. Okay, my first answer is like, like as a journalist. I mean, one thing is like this book, part of the, like, how do you write just narratives? It's like, okay, in the case of this book, part of the work was turning the mirror and looking at myself, not in a sort of like, ooh, look at me, but in a like, okay, what are these, what mythologies have I actually metabolized? And like, let me break those apart, like, where are my double standards here? Like, what are the ways my own family's reality has influenced, what I write and how I write it? Gosh, as a parent, I'm not sure. I have a 2-year-old. I find myself really excited about the prospect of taking her degree. So it's this really interesting thing that I'm like, I am still carrying on this, like, I want to take you to this place that means something to me. But it's also interesting because I have spent a lot of time in Greece in the past number of years, and it's been a really meaningful intellectual, moral, and professional world. So I have a number of people there, and they're like places that mean something to me. So it's funny because on the one hand, I'm sort of like perpetuating this mythology of like, this is this place that means something to our family. Although a place can mean something to your family, of course, we decide what's meaningful. But also actually have meaningful relationships and connections there now. So I don't know, perhaps that, but I'm not sure that I feel like, I am a different person. I see this completely differently as a parent. Only that, like, seeing all of these women, in families with their kids and putting their kids on these boats, like, there's just, this is a cliche, but it's like, you just feel so much more intensely what that is once you're a parent, what that would be once you're a parent. Yeah.
Cool. All right, let's take our final break. This is a song called Seafoam by Blue Wednesday. What do you guys?
I honestly forget this one. I'm so excited.
Okay. Well, this is a discovery for us all. Seafoam by Blue Wednesday.
Okay, that was Seafoam by Blue Wednesday. You're listening to the Apex Radio Hour here on KSUU Thunder 91.1. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Okay, thank you, Kason. This is our final segment where we ask what's bringing us joy. So, Lauren Markham, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
You know, I love this question. I love that you ask it. On the plane yesterday, I brought my daughter on the plane, and she entertained herself for the entire plane so that I could start a book I've been wanting to start for a really long time, which is Anne Carson's An Autobiography of Red, which is a totally strange book that's a combination of a novel in verse and an inquiry into a reimagined myth and an inquiry into an old philosopher. And it's totally joyful and in part connected to this book. One of the things that my book is doing is, I'm not trying to compare myself to Anne Carson. What I love about her book is that she's rupturing form and she's breaking form, not just for fun, although one feels the spirit of kind of artistic enjoyment in doing that. But the breaking of the form sort of serves a function in what she's doing. And that was definitely something I was trying to do with my book of like, okay, I've already written the sort of first and then version of a story about immigration and border injustice. I need to break the form here. And it's just a total delight and totally joyful to read something that is doing that so beautifully and in such an exalted way, and also to be able to do it next to my 2-year-old while she's like entertaining herself was also super joyful because I'm like, new era, I get to read while she's
New
here.
World. Okay, The Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson.
You got it.
All right, Kate Scherer, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
Mine's a little less profound.
That's okay.
I went and saw Jersey Boys at TuaCon on Monday night. And so I've been listening to the soundtrack pretty extensively. I love Frankie Valli, Four Seasons. I think their story is super, super interesting. And if any listeners have not seen Jersey Boys at TuaCon, I highly, highly recommend it. It was a phenomenal production. There were fireworks, so why wouldn't you check it out?
Did they take out the swears?
There were a few of them. Pretty tame. But
those Jersey Boys don't mess around.
They do not.
All right. We do have this is the last week that without Lauren Bird, one of our other student producers. She'll be here with us next week. So what is bringing her joy this week is the Disney Plus series Agatha All Along, which she enjoys the various witches and the songs they used to introduce it. And you'll get to hear her talk about her joy live next week. So, Case and Graff, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
Mine's a little bit different. So I'm in marching band, and this week is homecoming. So we've got, of course, the home football game, and I'm super excited for our both pregame and halftime shows. They're going to be really fun. And we're doing movies, I think, for this show. So we're doing movies part 1 and 2. Each of our shows has 3 parts. This week we're doing movies parts 1 and 2. So that's going to be When You Wish Upon a Star, Star Wars, James Bond, Indiana Jones, and Marvel across the 2 movements. So I'm thrilled for that, and I hope to see y'all at the football game because it's going to be fun.
So you're not going to do the perennial marching band favorite, You Can Call Me Al?
It's a great one.
All right.
It might be in part 3. I don't know.
There you go.
All right, Ryan, what are you currently watching, reading, listening to, or playing that is bringing you joy?
I'm behind the times on this one, but my wife and I rarely get a chance to watch TV as we have a young kid as well. And but we've figured that out because, like Lauren, we figured out ways to entertain so we can watch shows. So we have come across and have devoured seasons 1 and 2 of Reacher.
All right.
And I got to tell you, that is a show that makes me smile. I mean, yeah, it's violent and all, but Reacher. Sometimes I wish I could be like that. I mean, not like that buff because I'll never be that way. But it's just sometimes fun. Not fun's not the right word. Satisfying. I don't know. Maybe I'm perverse that way, but to watch the bad guys get beaten up because that's what Reacher does. He beats up the bad guys, right? And you always know that the bad guys are going to lose and Reacher's going to beat them up, and everyone gets what they're coming in the end. So Reacher has brought me great joy this time. So with that, I'm grateful that Lauren Markham is here. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing your work with us as well. And, of course, in the words of the great American poet Bill Withers, I wish you well.
Thank you so much. Really an honor to be here. Thanks.
All right. So we're going to go out with the last song, Soturo by Constantinople.
Yep.
Do you want to give us a final?
Same thing. This same band, Constantinople, this is from another album. I just love that their sound is both ancient and contemporary and bends borders.
Okay, thanks. Pick up her book, The Lauren Markham, A Map of Future Ruins, and this is Sotoro by Constantinople.
Alatani sutura, fase so sutura. Alatani simayala, fase so simayala. Ni alai so sutura, isake sutura kan. Alatani sutura, fase so sutura. Alatani simayala, fase so simayala. Ni alai so sutura, isake sutura kan. Salvato sita, alinga vilinga sali. Salvato sita. Alatani suturala, alatani simayala, alatani darjala. Ni ali musubitila, yanta ke kunna, kulu kulu kulu. Sanamasa, Batamasa, Ulatamasa, Batamasa, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, Lola Mulalati. Allah kill, Allah flante, Allah sabante. alatani sutulala alatani simayala alatani darjola miyali wasubitila dantala kikuna kulu 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 aladam